Welcome to Bible/Chat. Jason, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good to see you. We, as you know, chat about the Bible, and so we're going to pick up a new topic today.
Yep.
And last time we talked about spiritual gifts and the gift of tongues.
We did.
And you very helpfully kind of divided between maybe a miraculous event that takes place versus a gift of tongues.
Right.
And how the gifts were attesting miracles. That was really the intention of those things, which kind of led to another question.
Of course. And the question then has to do with that very famous chapter, 1 Corinthians 13, which talks about things like gift ceasing. So what's going on there?
Yeah.
And how does that play into like the whole charismatic versus cessationist
Okay,
debate?
good. Yeah, very good question. Yeah, so real quickly, if you're watching this or listening to this, we'd want you to have your Bible open, just so you can look at these specific texts. We both have a Bible open in front of us, but if we're just going to walk through it here real quick.
Yeah, please do.
In verse 8 of 1 Corinthians 13, Paul is telling them there's something better than gifts, and the reason for that is because the Corinthian church was all about like the public, sort of doing things in public, and we find that out in chapter 14. He says you guys are so disorderly because everyone wants to get up and talk, and so he says, listen, there's something better than all those public gifts. There's love. And really, like the love chapter, it goes on posters and stuff. But what's actually happening there is Paul saying that's better than all these other like public gifts.
Yeah.
You need to have love.
Yeah.
And in fact, he says if you speak with tongues, and you don't have love, it's empty. So he's giving that, and then in verse 8 he says, well, love never fails, right? So that's the reality of what love is, how it's a constant thing, how it always informs everything for one who's walking in the Spirit. He says, but if there are gifts of prophecy, or if there's prophecy, that gifts is just inserted by the NASB, they will be done away. If there are tongues, they will cease. If there is knowledge, it will be done away.
Yeah.
And then we say, well, what are those three things, right? What's happening there? And he says, and in verse 9, he says, for we know in part, we prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, the partial will be done away. And this is where all the debate is the use of that word perfect.
Yep.
So those three things, prophecy, tongues, and knowledge, show up in chapter 12. And all three of those things are revelatory, right?
Yeah.
There's a word of knowledge, right? There's the word of prophecy, and there are tongues. All three are direct gifts from the Spirit that give revelation.
Yes.
And so when he says those three things are going to pass away, they'll be done away, and they'll cease, what he's talking about is how all of that revelation is going to stop at some point.
Right.
In the early church, there wasn't a New Testament. They didn't know how to do church. The church in Corinth, they didn't have, this is the first letter to the Corinthians. They didn't have a manual on how to do church. They just had the apostles, and then the apostles would send letters, and those became the manuals for the church.
Yep.
But they didn't have any of these texts, and so the revelation of the Spirit was for the purpose of protecting and growing and maintaining the church, and that was done through miraculous things.
Right.
And so that was the purpose of tongues. They were there as a sign that what was being communicated was true.
Right.
Now, why would they need that? Well, because they didn't have the New Testament, but when the New Testament came, they didn't need it anymore. And that's why when he says in verse 9, so in verse 10, when the perfect comes, the partial will be done away. And that word perfect, a lot of people think, well, that's the second coming. And they get that because of verse 12. He says, now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I will know fully, just as I have also been fully known. Which, of course, that is the second coming of verse 12.
Yeah.
So then is the word perfect in verse 10 talking about the second coming? The way we'd answer that is no.
Okay.
And the reason for that is because the exact same word is used in chapter 14, verse 20. He says, brothers, do not be children in your thinking, yet in evil be infants, but in your thinking be, and then that word is the exact same word as in chapter 13, verse 10, be mature. So what Paul's talking about here in verse 10 is maturity. He's not talking about miraculous things or any of those things. He's not talking about the second coming. He's talking about maturity. Yeah. And he says, right now there's a partial thing that's not mature, but a day is coming when it will be mature. And the way we know that is verse 11. He says, when I was a child, I used to speak like a child, think like a child, reason like a child, but when I became a man, I did away with childish things. So what he's saying is, childish things are this kind of revelatory chaos that was happening in the Corinthian church, causing all that disorder. And a mature thing will come. What's the mature thing? Well, it's this. It's the completed New Testament canon. And when that comes, there's no more need for those revelatory gifts to take place.
Absolutely.
One of which is tongues.
Yeah.
And so all of those revelatory gifts, I have a word of knowledge, I have a word of prophecy, I have a tongue, all these things. Paul says those things are sort of childish. And but when the true, complete canon comes, then we'll know. Yeah. And then he says, and guess what? The canon will be there. And he says, in the future, we're going to know Christ. Verse 12, the second coming is coming. Exactly. So he's saying there's steps of the church, and he sees that motion of the steps of the church. And so we would say, I mean, I think you would agree.
Yeah, I do.
We would say that the perfect is the New Testament. When the canon was completed, the need for any revelatory gift whatsoever ended.
Yep.
And therefore, Paul is actually saying all that stuff's going to cease. It's going to be done away. It's going away.
Yeah. And that one day faith will become sight.
Exactly.
You know? You won't need your Bible anymore.
Yeah, exactly. You won't need a Bible. Exactly. You'll know Jesus.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Thanks. That's really, really helpful actually to walk through that.
Good. All right. Well, thanks so much. Hope that's helpful for you. Thanks.